Graham Brown in the Asia Tech Podcast studio. And this is Asia Matters. So what's Asia Matters all about? Asia Matters is all about sharing with you what matters in Asia and sharing why it matters to Asia and also the rest of the world. So what crosses your social media feed on a regular basis? I'm going to unpack and pick what's important and tell you why that matters. Starting here today, if you've been watching these crazy scenes coming out of India, let's have a look at the tape here. So you've probably seen these scenes come up on your LinkedIn maybe. Now that din, that noise is crowds of thousands, and they look like they're panicking, they look like they're running away, evacuating from either some kind of earthquake or tsunami or maybe terrorist attack, and then they are lining up against the barricades. And it ain't some kind of disaster evacuation, even though they're going to be handing out emergency supplies any minute now. No. In fact, these are crowds at Ikea's Indian opening day, believe it or not. Tens of thousands of Indians from the city of Hyderabad, which is a tier 1 city in India, queuing up, being squashed to death, waiting to get their sofas and their kitchen towels. All there you go. There are the Swedes on video handing out the emergency supplies. So apparently this is fun. Well, for Indian consumers, this might be. I mean, let's have a look at what's going on here. So this is the first store in India to open, and it's a big deal because it's not just about Ikea. This is about a bigger picture. This is about India's middle class. So let's have a look at some of the data on India's middle class. If we can jump back to the presentation here. First of all, just take a look at this traffic. These are the queues of people waiting to get into Ikea on its opening day. I mean, the only time you actually see queues like this is maybe on Chinese New Year, when you see those people sort of rushing to go back to their villages. It's just crazy. So this is caused by Ikea. And so what is going on? Well, firstly, Ikea India probably is very similar to any Ikea around the world, except that it's aimed at Indian consumers. There's a few sort of nice twists in here, such as the fact that India's Ikea hopes to be offering delivery by solar-powered rickshaws. I don't know if this is a bit of a gimmick. They claim to be solar powering up their delivery fleet by 20%. 20% of their deliveries will be powered by sun-powered rickshaws. Apart from that, this is about Ikea's expansion into India's burgeoning middle class. So let's have a look at that. Some of the data here, and I'll talk you through this. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I'll try and explain the data to you. If you're watching along on video or LinkedIn, then please feel free to comment as we do. So what's happening with the changing face of Indian consumers? This is data from Boston Consulting Group, and basically what it's saying is that India's number of Indian households which describe themselves as affluent as a percentage of the total has grown from 4% in 2005 and is predicted to go to 16% by 2025. So within a generation, it's multiplied by 4 times. So just think about that. So from your parents' generation to your generation, if you were Indian growing up now, there are 4 times as many people in your generation who are affluent than in your parents' generation. So this is part of a bigger picture of the growing Indian, and Asian middle classes. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about middle classes in Asia is done in the context of China, because obviously China was first. I mean, let's have a look at some of the data here. So this is the data from ILO, which basically shows us that from, let's say, between 2015 and 2019 projected, if you want to look at the top of this graph, so if you're listening, let me describe this to you. The top of this graph shows that the middle classes are roughly about 1 billion in number. So that's a significant percentage of the world. So think about this now, where we've come from, 2009, there were roughly 750 million middle-class people in Asia. By 2030, that's predicted to go to 3.5 billion. So that's a 4 to 5 times increase in 20 years. Think about that. And by 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be living in Asia. The data here from Brookings Institution shows us that 5 times increase. I mean, if you were to visualize this statistic, you can see a graph where virtually all the growth in middle class over one generation from 2009 to 2030 comes from Asia. And the two biggest inputs into that growth, obviously China, and a lot of that has already been factored in, and India, and that is coming through now. Have a look at this chart here, which is from Global Harvest, from the GAP report, which is just fascinating, which basically shows us how the Indian middle class hasn't just doubled in a matter of years, it's just multiplied many folds over. So if you go back to 2015, there were approximately 100 to 150 million middle class in India out of 1.3 billion. So let's say that's 12 to 13% of the population in 2015. Fast forward to 2030, where are we? India's middle class will be India's population will be 1.5 billion. The middle class will be 1.2. So that's roughly 80%. So where have we come from? So around about 2015, so a few years ago, 150 million in India. So it's about 13% to 80% within 10, 20 years, 15 years. So let me just I'm just getting a little bit lost in the stats here. Let me just summarize that. India's middle class has grown from 12 to 13% 2015. And in 15 years, it will grow to 80% of the population. That is a growth, let's put this together, of 1 billion people. 1 billion people becoming middle class in 15 years. If that isn't going to impact everything, I don't know what is. A lot of how this impacts is not just in terms of how they spend and the economics, but it also impacts the psychology. Looking at this data here, this shows, and we'll reflect some of this in the Asia Matters report, which I'll come to in a minute. We'll reflect some of this in the psychological profile of the middle class and how they differ from their parents. What's interesting here is that if you look at the data here, middle class families believe their children will be better off, and they are generally a lot more optimistic about the future than their parents. And that sort of follows the pattern across all of Asia. Now, that impacts, for example, not only their behavior, but what they spend money on. So they're more likely to spend money on speculative or investment-based products or products which rely on the future. Whereas if you're less positive about the future, if you're more cautious, you will spend more money on, for example, like more security-based products like insurance maybe, or pensions. As the middle class grow, they're going to spend more money on things which are less about security and comfort and more about enjoying life. So here's a big factor here. If we have a look at the CIA fact book, the latest data that they published about India is fascinating. That India is one of the youngest populations in the world. The median age, it's not the average age, the median age, roughly the average, is 27 years in India. So what does that mean? Compare this to, say, the US, where it's 37 years, and Japan, which is 46 years. So let's compare India to US and Japan. There's two interesting stories here. Firstly, India is 10 years younger on average than the USA, and 20 years younger than Japan. Younger people contribute more to the economy, they take away less from the economy, and they have more productive years left in them. So as an economy, that's a good thing. If your economy is like Japan, is dying out and needing care, that drags on all the economy, but also on the productive people, because they have to look after the older populations. And this has an impact, for example, on how things are going to turn out in earning potential. I'm just skipping a slide here. Looking at India and China in terms of their earning potential, this is a really interesting story, reflecting the figures I've just shared with you. Chinese and Indians, so take Indians in particular. So if you were in India, if you were Indian, you're more likely to peak in your earning potential around about 35 years old. So if you took a cross-section of the population, what that means in India, the people with the most money, the people earning the most money, are most likely to be around 35 years old. Compare that to, say, the US. If you took a cross-section of the population, the most money will be found in people who are 55 years old, so 20 years older. So what does that mean? It means, obviously, where there is money, there is power, there is influence. The most influential element of the population in India is going to be 35 years old, whereas in the US it's 55 years old, meaning you're going to have a much more dynamic population. So, rounding up, we've been talking about India's middle class. We've been talking about how they are shaping the future of retail. Just jumping back here, one of the figures that I didn't share from earlier, but it's out of sync with my presentation. Apologies, everybody. But online retail is spending. This is really the story of Ikea as well, and the whole boom in e-commerce in India. We're looking at the growth of online retail in India. It's now roughly about, what are we saying, 150 million buyers online, about $20 billion. And that has grown how many fold? It's grown tenfold in the last 6 years. So where will it grow from here? It's only going to go up. History teaches us that change is a constant. If you don't see the slides, if you're not sort of watching along on the video on LinkedIn or YouTube, if you're listening on the podcast, the point here is that if you look at history in the longer time frame, what we're seeing now is not necessarily anything new. One of the big stories, obviously, about why Asia matters is the re-emergence, not the emergence, of economies like China and possibly India. So we're in a situation now where China will possibly pass the USA as the world's biggest economy within the next 2 to 3 years. India is following behind. But this, again, is not something new. History repeats itself in cycles. If you go back hundreds of years, China, and then before China, India were the world's biggest economies by GDP. In the Middle Ages, when the Europeans are rolling around in the mud and fighting each other, India and China were centers of the world in terms of culture and science. We're seeing a re-emergence of that, so it's nothing new. But for us to see Asia in these contexts is a very, it's a challenging context in the, for this generation, because we've always been used to the West being the most dominant culture. So when we see these sort of scenes from India, what we're starting to witness is this growth of the middle class, which is bringing forward a population, a market of people who have money and aren't just working in warehouses to service the West, but they're also spending money on themselves, their own houses, their own furnishings, and making their lives better. And the interesting thing is you're seeing brands like Ikea going in and creating these lifestyle brands in India. But on top of this, the next wave is A2A. So we talked about India's middle class. We talked about Asia's middle class today as a major growth story. The next stage is A2A, Asia to Asia. Now, Asia does more trade with itself than it does with the rest of the world. Put that into the context of Asia's middle class. What will the world look like if Asia was almost self-sufficient? Where you had Asian brands servicing Asian middle-class consumers, it wouldn't need the West to survive. That is why Asia matters. Be interested to hear your comments. Thanks for watching and listening along to this part of Asia Matters today. My name is Graham Brown. I'll share with you an insight or a group of insights every week from social media, from the latest trends, the latest news that cross your feeds, unpack the most important and pick the ones that you should be following to understand why Asia matters. Graham Brown, thanks a lot.